Welcome to the Art Biz, where we dive deep into the business of being an artist, sharing stories, strategies, and insights from working artists and art professionals. I'm Alyson Stanfield, and my mission on this show, as well as in all of my classes and coaching programs at Art Biz Success, is to help you elevate your career, amplify your visibility, and connect your art to the people who matter most. If you are looking for strategies to grow your business, market your work effectively, and take control of your career, you are in the right place. You can hop on over to artbizsuccess.com right now and see how I can help. This episode is part one of a two-part conversation with Noelle Phares, an artist who has left behind a career in environmental science to pursue her life dream. In this episode, we focus on how that bold transition happened and how Noelle's scientific background continues to shape her career. She brings a research-driven mindset to everything she does, especially to large projects, like her solo museum exhibition at the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art last year. Noelle shares how she approached that project, from the initial concept to the cross-disciplinary research trip, and what she learned about working with curators and institutions. We also talk about what it means to treat your art practice as a series of intentional, story-rich projects, and how Noelle balances beauty with deeper environmental meaning. If you've ever dreamed of creating more thoughtful, ambitious work or taking your career to the next level, this conversation will both inspire and challenge you. Here's my conversation with Noelle Phares. Hi, Noelle. Welcome to the Art Biz.
Hey, Allison. So nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
I'm so glad that you're here. What was the moment that you knew you needed to leave science and become a full-time artist?
Yes, I have thought about that so many times looking back. In hindsight, it was a bolder turn than I think I even realized at the time. I had a clear internal message one day that it was time for me to kind of leave that current job. I didn't know right in that moment that it would turn into a full-time art career, but I knew I needed to leave that job. And the job that I was kind of leaving at the time was I'd spent the 3 years since graduate school. I did a graduate degree in environmental science, environmental data science, and I loved it. I was working for a small, growing, fast-growing tech company. I was an environmental scientist. I had a background in biochem. The field was so important. We were focused on building tech-based tools to help farmers use less water and waste less fertilizer and just kind of so many of the things that make farming really harmful. So I really believed in that. I still do as kind of a staunch environmentalist conservationist, but I was waking up every day hating going to work. And it was disconcerting. I think I had recently turned 30 or was about to turn 30, and I had spent, you know, pretty much all my time since I was 18, starting college, kind of committed to this career path in the sciences. So, there was some cognitive dissonance there. My heart of hearts was like, I love this field, I love the topic, but I don't really love practicing it. It was very structured. Most of my work was on the computer. I really am someone who likes to see concrete outcomes from my work. I was like, I have nothing physical to show for myself. It's also abstract. So just the abstract nature of the work and the fact that I think working as a scientist, as much as I loved, again, learning about the sciences, I had a knack for it. The jobs that I was finding myself in, despite looking so good to me on paper, they didn't really pull out my natural talents that much, which I have a knack for art. I was always into painting and drawing. That's kind of what I would do. I'd stay up all night in the middle of college, even though I ran track and I had track practice early in the next morning, or I had a big lab report due. It was like painting that I would find myself up till 3 in the morning doing as a hobby, being like, I gotta go to sleep, I gotta put this away. So I just quit out of the blue sort of one day, this job, and said there's got to be a better way for me to take this passion that I have for the natural sciences and environmental stewardship and conservation and do this in a way that just works with my natural rhythms and my natural talents better.
So you didn't like build up the art while you were working in the science, like sciencey stuff is what
No,
I'm
that's such a good question. No, I didn't. Other than, kind of just maintaining this like low hum of just hobby level art. I know so many people take maybe the wise move of, maintaining a consistent art practice while they work full time in another job to pay the bills. It just wasn't me. I'm kind of an all or nothing person. I quit that job. I'd never actually sold a painting before when I quit this job. To be fair, working in tech, I was like a high-level product manager for the small company, and there was a lot of creative work that went into that, despite it being really a science-backed role. We did a lot of graphic design, a lot of the marketing content, and all this. So my creative wheels were turning absolutely in that job and sort of previous jobs in the sciences, because so much of what we do in the modern world is, multidisciplinary. But no, I didn't. I quit that job. I decided, I didn't, it was kind of brewing in my mind, like maybe I've always had this dream of being an artist, but it seemed very far-fetched and abstract to me. I come from a family of people that worked in healthcare and the sciences. So I quit, and what I did was just say, I'm going to take 3 months off and really give myself the time to stew in like the question of, what changes do I want to make and just how my day works that feels less restricting to me and just speaks more to, I think, again, what my natural talents are. And after those 3 months, I had found myself painting every day. I had just kind of naturally started building a website for my artwork. This was again about 8 years ago, so it was a real heyday for Instagram and social media. And also, web platforms like Squarespace that made building your own website really easy. So the barrier to kind of, creating this online presence just to like get this little burgeoning regular art practice out there in the world was there. It was kind of easy to do that at the time. And 3 months in, I was like, you know what? I think my heart of hearts knows that I've always had this wild dream of being an artist, which felt really counter to this career as a pretty structured scientist before. And I just dove in, and my friends and family and my parents who helped me pay for grad school, and my now husband, Taylor, who's so supportive from the beginning, which I really appreciate. But I was kind of like, oh my God, are you sure? And I just said, I think this is the right move for me. I'm going to dive in. And so I did. I kind of, about 3 months later, I was like, okay, I'm no longer unemployed. I am now going to dive into, basically full-time work, which was totally self-imposed, trying to build this art career. And that's what that
Yeah.
change looked like for me.
Do you think the rigor of being a scientist helped you start your art career?
Yeah, absolutely. In so many ways. I mean, for one part, I think just, having have been 30 when I decided to make this change, excuse me. I wasn't fresh out of art school. I wasn't fresh out of undergrad and something else. I'd been working for 10 years basically, including time in graduate school, which was very project based as well. So that was even my graduate work was, something that prepared me for the work world. I was used to working hard towards a specific goal. And so, just the rigor of my work ethic was really helpful. I was pretty clear from the beginning that if I was going to, give this art thing a shot, it still took me about a year before I was willing to let go of this kind of title, this career title as a scientist, and claim this kind of abstract title of artist. It took me about a year to do that. But, when I decided 3 months after quitting that job, okay, I'm going to give this art thing a shot, I said, okay, that means getting up at I'm getting up and I'm going to put in 8 hours a day. And at the time, I was a major night owl, so sometimes that looked like starting at 12 and working for 5 hours and then picking it up from like 12 to 3 a.m. I loved that flexibility, but I always put in the time. So the work ethic was huge, and it still serves me to this day. I put in very regular hours at the studio. I think that the scientific process and my background there has most best served me in this career and just helping me select what the topics and themes of exhibitions are that I'm going to paint. So much of environmental science is looking at really big picture topics that have so many contributing factors, sometimes massive data sets involved, and just trying to drill down to, what is like the core of the problem that we're talking about here, whether it's a climate change related issue or that there's so many, it's such
Yeah.
a broad field, but there's so much work in calling the signal from the noise. And that is absolutely part of shaping a good show, I think, for an artist, myself included at the very beginning. The most intimidating part can just be looking at the blank canvas, whether that's a physical canvas or just, the 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 onset of a deadline for an exhibition 6 months away, and it's a blank slate, and learning how to take a whole bunch of information, squeeze it down into something discrete that I could tackle as a scientist is the same practice that I use as an artist now.
Mhm.
The outcomes are really different, but those serve each other. So my research process, it comes like kind of right from how I did as a scientist. And then there's other
Yeah.
skills like public speaking, writing, all of the storytelling that comes into making, artistic work have a story behind it. That also comes from my experience as a scientist.
You said something that I don't want to gloss over, but it is a mindset that not all artists have, and that is painting for an exhibition. Like painting
Yes.
you consider each body of work a project.
Yeah, that's such a good distinction, Allison. Yeah, I do. And, some of that comes again from the way that my mind learned to work in my past career. But even from the very beginning, it was intimidating to quit this pretty clearly laid out career path and just on this wishy-washy, I'm going to be an artist thing. So even from the beginning, I was like, what's a good first step here? What's a project I can take on that'll serve this longer term goal of being able to create a sustainable business around the artwork, and all of the other things that I thought would go into creating this long term art career path. And so my first goal was like, I need to create a small series that I can run prints of and sell them on Etsy. And I like embarked on this project of creating, I don't know, I think about 8 to 10 watercolors at the time, landscape based. But I thought of that as a project, and my project was, create a series of 8 to 10 works that I show to my emerging Instagram audience and get some feedback on, and then see if they sell. And, I had some luck there. So that approach kind of shaped the way that I moved through the work for the next few years and even till now today. And it served me really well when my career progressed to the point where I was, being invited to create exhibitions for galleries or a museum. I know that not every artist, I think, approaches an exhibition like an opportunity to tell a distinct story, but I really do. Um, and
Yeah, you just made
yeah, my
that leap.
first,
You just made that
go
leap
ahead. Yeah.
from project, like, I'm going to paint 20 new paintings along this theme, to I'm going to paint 20 new paintings that tell a story.
That's so right. And fit into like the longer narrative
Yeah.
of kind of the work I've been working on over time, have the potential to have some writings that accompany them that go together and tell a deeper story. And then in the last year or two, as I've been working more with museums, I am now thinking forward enough to think about the programming that might
Mhm.
go along with an exhibition, which means artist talks, talks with other collaborating artists or scientific advisors. That was kind of a big part of the show I did last year, which hopefully we can talk about later. It was about the Colorado River, but I had so much more opportunity to create some programming where we had conversations with other
Yeah.
scientists and people that had some area expertise in like the topic that I was loosely painting about. So being able to like understand what these other voices and expertises might bring in has been something that's just served me really well too as I try to unite this science background ever more with my
Yeah.
current art practice.
Well, I think it's an important distinction. There's no wrong or right way to have an art business or career these days. And I love being able to talk to so many artists who do it so many different ways. I think the way that you are approaching your career is very high level thinking. The research based work, the painting or making work, doesn't have to be painting, making work that is cohesive, it tells a cohesive story and fits with the rest of your work is very different from painting those first 8 to 10 pieces and putting them on
Yeah.
Etsy to see if they'll sell.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, that the shape of how I approach the project-based work has like really matured over time. Totally. But I don't know. I've always been grateful for the kind of that structure that that past mindset brought to it. Not that that's not to say I don't leave room for a lot of experimentation and kind of play work that's really just for my own creative benefit and
Yeah.
growth. I do leave a lot of work for that outside of like the project-based work. And I don't really do commissions. When I'm saying project-based work, again, it's more creating work like for a specific exhibition. But I've been able to. I'm someone who sells almost everything I make, which means if I'm creating a bunch of studies, before creating actual big paintings, or I still mostly work with galleries, but I also sell out of my studio, and we can talk about that later. And I have assistants that take work to art festivals and stuff like that. There's a market for, all of the little work that goes on behind the scenes and really keeps it fresh for me. So I
Well,
work in that too. It's really, I think, important for, I think, any artist to leave room for some play because that's where a lot of the growth and innovation happens.
it's easy to shine a spotlight on artists like Noelle. She's so articulate about her work and the ideas behind it. But I know that for many artists, talking about your art isn't quite so easy. You might struggle to explain who you are, what you do, or why you do it. Not because you don't care, but because you haven't had the right questions to guide you. And that's exactly why I created From Studio to Spotlight, a free guide packed with 28 prompts to help you reflect on your journey, uncover your stories, and speak or write about your art with more clarity and confidence. These are the stories you'll need for your bio, grant application, interviews, press releases, and artists' talks. Get your free copy of From Studio to Spotlight at artbizsuccess.com/SM. That's artbizsuccess.com/SM, as in social media. Now, back to my conversation with Noelle Phares. Because you've dropped hints about it here and there, I want to talk about your subject matter. You've said that the vulnerability of natural resources is your why, and that your work is a balance between beauty and environmental awareness. I think that maybe the best way to expand on that is to talk about your tracking time exhibition that I saw at the Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art last year. Could you describe it for people?
Yeah, I would love to. That was such a special project for me, and it continues to be. But yes, my largest goals, I think, as an artist are to, I want my work to promote a greater respect for the limits of natural resources, to promote the conservation of wild spaces, and just to encourage active planning for the future of all living organisms. I think those are kind of my like overarching, goals as what I as an environmental artist, similar to as they were as a scientist. So to that end, Boulder Museum of Contemporary Art a couple years ago now came to me and asked and invited me to exhibit with them. I still had to go through a full proposal phase where it was up to me to think about, what could an exhibition that's based around painting but involves some collaborations look like that would create an engaging show for an audience that was, mostly based in Colorado, but it's a museum, so there's some national presence there too. And it felt like a great opportunity for me to, think more about programming and about coming up with a topic that was relevant in today's environmental conversations and also for the geography that's like specific to Colorado and Boulder where this show would be. So I went through a lot of different potential topics and actually, I wrote this whole proposal for a project that I was so excited about, and I learned a lot about kind of what not to do when pitching a project for some sort of institutional exhibition later, I just went like way too deep in the weeds and thorough on planning this whole exhibition that was going down just another avenue. And, the museum was excited about it. I knew there were some potentials for there to be some legal issues just because it was working with not an author's pre-existing work. And I'd gotten his go ahead on that project, but eventually his agents were like, there's some copies with literary problems with literary copyright. So that got shot down. So I spent so much time on that proposal. I was like, I gotta,
Can we tell people that it was 40 pages long?
yeah, it's about 40 pages long, including some images. But, as a planner, I certainly, I want, when I'm pitching a project, I want to get far down enough to be able to like propose what some of the paintings might actually look like. So I had come up with like the plans for the actual paintings, describing them and creating some studies and whatnot, which to be fair, I was trying to engage a high level author who'd won a Pulitzer for this book. So I wanted the vision for him, for that author to be clear. But again, I got too deep in the weeds there. So I reeled myself back once that got shot down. And I said, okay, I need to come up with a theme that can kind of speak for itself a little more without having to have me explain myself on what the final outcome was going to look like so much. So I tried to zoom out and just, again, look at a big picture topic that would speak to a really, really large audience. And the Colorado River was just, it came like beaming down at me. I was actually in my car one day listening to CPR. It's like the Colorado chapter of NPR. But it actually was, I think, an NPR-based segment. It was a national conversation about the Colorado River. It's been really hot in the news for the last couple years. We, as a society, kind of revisit the way water is allocated from that river. And I was like, oh my gosh, that's right. The Colorado River, it's such an important topic. It's such a red herring for just kind of water scarcity and the struggles that we have with water availability in the modern world, especially in the Southwest. And then some bonuses. My twin sister has a PhD in hydrology. She has some specific expertise in the Colorado River. And I also have personal experience with the Colorado River. I have rafted the Grand Canyon for 3 weeks. I've done a lot of rafting in Colorado, stretches of it. I spent a lot of time, about 10 years in Southern California, in cities that get their water from the river itself, despite being hundreds of miles away. I had some idea of just how complicated just the picture is around what that water goes through to feed up to 40 million people. So it was perfect. And then the other thing, as an artist, I'm someone who never wants to paint the same thing twice. If I'm gonna paint an exhibition, I come up with a theme. I want to make sure that that theme is kind of broad enough for me to, and pull in a lot of different landscapes to interpret within those paintings. The river goes through mountainous Colorado. It goes through the deserts of Arizona and Utah. It goes through so many different landscape types and just the ways in which humanity has manipulated that river's flow and engineered systems to move it long distances. It's really diverse. So I knew there was just a lot of opportunity to depict and explore that river in a lot of different ways. So can I talk about the research process a little bit
Sure,
and sort of how I
please.
structured the show? Sure. I will often, kind of couple these high level conversations with myself and planning phases with, the end goal, which is, there's a three-dimensional space. There was a museum. I knew what the square footage and layout of the museum was. So, I'm kind of early on thinking like, how many paintings are we talking about? How big can they be? How can they be organized, within spaces? So is there some opportunity to kind of like tell some distinct stories along the way? So I had a vision pretty early on that I would create series of paintings that were tied to specific locations along the river. So I worked with my sister pretty closely to identify key areas along the river that were, visually very different from each other, visually recognizable to a large audience, places like the Grand Canyon, Lake Powell, and the Hoover Dam. And, also places where there were like very distinct kind of environmental issues that had arisen over the years, tied to those specific locales and the way that the water was used from those spaces. So I came up with 7 regions that I wanted to kind of depict visually, and I decided that it was time to go on a research trip. I typically, my artistic process involves doing most of my painting in my studio, but because I'm usually referencing real places for at least part of the paintings, especially for this project, I try to reference my own photography. So I planned about a 9-day research trip where I'd be hitting all 7 of those locations. I took my camper van. I have a great camper van, and it's also modular enough for me to move all that stuff out and fill it up with art when we need to go to art shows that are a long ways away. And I spent about 9 days hitting those 7 spots. I took my nice camera. I took a ton of pictures. I took a sketchbook with me. My sketchbook practice is, hit or miss. It's not a huge part of what goes into final paintings later, but I knew that I wanted some sketches. Again, this was a museum show, so there was going to be some opportunity to kind of show some of my process work as part of this exhibition, which is pretty different from a gallery show where they just want polished work. So I took that sketchbook with me, and I spent a lot of time in each of those places sketching what I was seeing. I was like listening to other tourists around me in places like the Grand Canyon or, Glenwood Canyon in Colorado, some of the places that we all recognize as Coloradans. And I sketched views that I loved, views that I had seen just from the river and maybe not from the roadside before. I sketched local foliage and kind of tried to capture the way that the landscape was changing along the course of that river. The river flows for 1,450 miles. It's a long way. Too, there's a lot of tributaries and headwaters, but I started at what's considered the actual headwaters in Colorado, which I had been planning for this project for quite a long time before I started the trip. But I was like, really excited to go see the official headwaters, which I knew was like one of the 7 regions that I was going to paint. And I was like, let's go see the headwaters. The Colorado River is such a forest. The river is massive later on. But I showed up to Laputa Pass Lake, actually, which is about an hour and a half from Denver driving. And it was like this tiny little pond in the middle of nowhere. And like someone at some point just was kind of like, okay, we're just going to call that the headwaters. Because in reality, headwaters are the culmination of just like countless little trickles
Right,
of
right,
water.
yeah.
So kind of like in the same way that someone just like put a pin on the map and said, okay, we're going to call this the headwaters. I also, the task of like drilling down to these 7 locations I was going to paint felt a little bit like that. I'm like, it's a little bit arbitrary because there's 1,450 miles along this river. Like each vista has its own unique aspects. But I was like, let's just cut the fat and like just cut down to these 7 locations. So I did that research trip. I came back to the studio and I had about 6 months, I think, to paint full paintings, 30 sketches. The full paintings ranged from 30 by 40 to 60 by 48 inches, all oil, acrylic, and gouache on panel. And I did about 3 paintings per location. And again, I'm quite organized, so I split those paintings up into triads. So it was kind of like a repetition of the same system at each of these places. And in this big landscape painting that I did for each location, I kind of just depicted like a recognizable view of that spot and with some symbolism involved, I guess, for just kind of the overarching meaning of that spot along the river. But then I did a painting that I considered the environmental painting, and I dove into depicting a topic that was kind of related to some environmental issue or controversy that had happened along that river. I can give you some examples in a second. And then I did what I called a diversion painting. And the diversion painting, you know, focused on how water was used from that part of the river to enable some sort of human growth elsewhere. I'll just give you one example. In the Lake Powell, Glen Canyon Dam sort of region, if you've ever been there before, Lake Powell's really beautiful, but that part of the river when that canyon or when that dam was built to form Lake Powell back in the 60s. There was a lot of controversy around what portion of the river was going to be dammed to create, a large water reservoir because there were parts of the Southwest that just like needed more reliable water source. And so there's just a ton of controversy around where to put that dam up. And they ended up putting it, where it is now. And they flooded all of Glen Canyon to produce Lake Powell. The diversion painting shows that dam, but it also shows a bunch of the architecture that I pulled from some of the nearby towns, from the early settlements that were enabled when that reservoir was created. So I'm kind of hinting at like what kind of structure and human settlement was enabled when that water was impounded. And then the environmental painting really showed Glen Canyon before it was flooded to form Lake Powell. And there was just a lot of controversy and despair around losing what was a really beautiful canyon and landscape before. So huge fights from the Sierra Club at the time around, the cost benefit analysis of creating this new water storage versus losing this natural habitat for a lot of different species, tourism, and all that stuff. And I worked in some symbolism from the era as well. That environmental painting that shows the canyon before it was flooded. It shows kind of a depiction of a breeze block wall that the dam went up in the 60s. So I, wanted to symbolize this wall that was coming up, but tie it to the time. So I've got like this very 1960s looking woman kind of sitting on the top of Rainbow Arch, which was a geologic feature that has been mostly flooded and is now out of view. And she's kind of just sitting, looking out over the canyon, looking pretty optimistic. It was such a heyday for these big environmental projects back in the 60s. So I pull in a lot of symbolism. I try to keep it interesting and beautiful and not too on the nose while inviting, the viewer to say, what is this breeze block wall actually stand for? And it stands for a dam. I don't necessarily want to paint the nuts and bolts of a dam, but I want to symbolize what actually happened there. So that was a long-winded answer, but I hope
No,
that helps.
that's okay. So you planned each of the paintings first. What did you learn about getting institutional support or working with the curator while this project was coming to fruition?
Yeah, that's such a good question, and there were a lot of learning opportunities because I'd never really worked with a curator before. I think just thinking about this talk, there were some questions that you raised about just like maintaining your artistic voice and your independence. And that was something that came up a lot for me in just creating this show was just I had a really strong vision of what I wanted for this exhibition. And there were many instances where it was kind of like coming head to head with what, this other entity wanted for the show. They had sort of their own visions. It was my first time, I think, really needing to advocate for my work and for my vision in a way that I hadn't before. It's kind of always been up to me at a gallery. So, I was having to think about the realities of like a budget for a museum when we're thinking about, hey, how can we display some of the writings that I did to go along with and interpret these? There's were real budget constraints about how that, additional content, copy content could be displayed. So, we really had to get creative with how that would work. And then the other big thing was, well, and then there were two things actually. One is just, it really reminded me, as a scientist, you face this all the time. You realize that to present your work to the scientific community is a really different task than presenting it to the wider audience that might not have any background knowledge. So, I would present some ideas for whatever this triad of paintings or like this avenue of work to the curator and some other folks on the museum team, and the feedback was like, whoa, 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 like back up, why is that relevant? What is kind of like the bigger picture here? And I was like, okay, that's right. I am creating this for an audience that might have no education around, current water issues or how many people the Colorado River serves, just all these background issues. So it just reminded me to scale back and like create a foundation of knowledge first before I could dive into these nitty gritty topics, which is really helpful. And then the other thing I want to mention was just there is a lot of controversy around land rights and just the history of interaction with native folks along these lands and rivers. And there's just a long history of, you know, horrible behavior on the part of settlers and Westerners who came in and just took over lands from indigenous people. So the curator was pretty intent, for good reason, on bringing in an indigenous voice to speak to some of those topics. As a white woman, I was very happy to also have some voices in this conversation that were not my own to be able to speak to some of those. So it was an interesting balance, kind of working with Chelsea Kaya was the other artist who was invited to contribute work to this show. And I learned a lot about institutionally how to kind of tread lightly around topics that might be controversial. I have a lot to learn on that for sure, but it was really my first run in with I think that element being a big part of a show. And to be fair, many times I've painted about topics that really need to be treated sensitively.
Hmm.
So that was a good learning experience. I've got a lot to learn there.
Yeah, it sounds like a real collaboration, which is very different from how a lot of artists are used to working. They're used to working with themselves in the studio for themselves, doing whatever they want. But when you take the work out and you want to quote unquote play a bigger game, you have to deal with people. And you have to
So
deal with
true.
bigger issues than yourself.
Yes, that is so true.
Yeah.
Which is really good to keep in mind because, as an artist, as any artist who hopes to create a sustainable career path for them, the work happens in the studio, probably, or for most people, but eventually it needs to go out and not only have a dialogue with a greater audience, but hopefully, be desirable to
Yeah.
own
Yeah.
for a greater audience. So I think it's always valuable to think about how people outside your studio are going to see, appreciate, or not your work. And I think about that quite a bit actually when I'm painting. I'm thinking about where is this painting going to go someday? Hopefully it stops at a gallery or a museum first, but someday it's going to be in someone's house. And I'm pretty much always trying to create work that has, a commercial appetite. I think some artists look down on that. I'm pretty committed to creating work that sells eventually, and I've done a good job with that. And I know part of that is my commitment to creating work that is desirable for
Right.
people to put in their homes. I My own studio actually has just a very homey look to it in a lot of ways. I have my own professional studio. My husband and I built it a few years ago with the build team, and I have lots of corners in here that are like seating areas that are very well curated. And there's like a big spot above my couch for a big painting, and many of my large paintings will spend some time above that couch where I'm just thinking about how does it pull this room together? What is it going to look like in someone's home someday?
Yeah, it's really beautiful. I will attest to
Thanks, Allison.
that. I and that is the higher level thinking around that isn't just that the work will sell, but that it has meaning to other people, that they want to live with it. I mean, selling is great, the money is great, but there's something beyond that that I think if I can put words in your mouth is very appealing to you.
Yeah, I appreciate that. You spoke earlier about just the whys for my art, and there are so many different whys. I already spoke to kind of just the bigger picture, like what do I hope my art will move in the world, but I have my own personal whys too around just like what feeds me as a working professional or person. And what really feeds me the most is just like seeing people connect to and
Yeah.
enjoy my work, and them buying the work is like the ultimate symbol of that. So, thinking about commercial viability is just always top of mind, always top of mind. Maybe it makes me vain or too dependent on, external validation, but like, yeah, I love watching people enjoy my
Yeah.
work. That's one reason why I've chosen, I'm pretty good at maintaining an active collector audience. I could just sell directly from my studio forever to commissions or whatever, but I am pretty committed to, this pathway where I'm showing with galleries and institutions because I love painting these bodies of work that end up in front of groups of people, because that's the big payoff moment to me.
Yeah.
Sometimes they'll spend 6 months alone in the studio, just working my butt off and hopefully interacting with other people along the way, but it's very isolating work. And knowing that there's some payoff at the end, which is like showing the world what I did, that's like what really keeps me going. So that's one of my whys, and not every artist has that as their why, but that's kind of what pushes me to continue creating commercially, a work that there's a commercial appetite for.
I think if any artist was honest with themselves, that they would realize what a high it is to have those moments of connection with the real work in a real space, with other people looking at it and talking about it, and it becoming the center of a dialogue that creates deeper meaning in those relationships and can have the potential to impact those people for a very, very long time.
Oh, you're so right. I mean, hopefully any piece of art that a collector buys, whether it's a print, and I do run a lot of prints in my work, helps me keep my price points super variable. I sell prints, and then the original paintings are at a very different price point, of course, but like eventually that work's gonna go live on someone's wall, and just the opportunity for that person to look at that painting every single day is, that's a real opportunity to me. And so it really shapes the topics that I choose to paint too, because I want, people's interest in anything stems from like their own personal ideals. People have a natural appetite for beauty. I certainly do. I prioritize beauty a lot in my life and in my work. Beauty is such a great tool to get people's attention. I said that before, that, I'm sometimes painting about pretty doom and gloom topics, but I try to think about beauty first. And, if I'm painting about climate change and the way that glaciers are melting and oil drilling and all this stuff, like I don't want to paint a doom and gloom picture of, oil rigs like decimating a beautiful landscape. I'm going to think about a much more symbolic way to do that, because, people don't want to look at sad, hard things all day. Beauty is just so much better and more sustainable as an attention grabber. So that's a tool that I use. And then the other thing I think about too, and just thinking about how will these people connect to this work, is people like to look at landscapes they have their own personal connection with. I care a lot more about paintings I'm working on, or paintings that someone else is working on that I'm drawn to, something that brings back a real feeling, a memory for me. And I know that's true in my work. So I'm often painting places that I know people have their own personal stories with, and I want to leave the depiction and the symbolism that's relating to the environmental story I want to tell. I want to leave that loose enough to where someone can also just look at this depiction of a place they know and love, and, see their own stories in it as well.
That wraps up part one of my conversation with Noelle Phares. She reminded us that structure and meaning don't limit creativity, they amplify it. Her story is a powerful example of what can happen when you treat your art like a project with purpose. So, before listening to part two, coming up, take a moment to reflect. What kind of project would give your art more structure and meaning right now? Why does it matter to you to do this? And how would it feel to complete it and share it with others? Part 2 comes out next week. In the meantime, you can read the show notes, watch the video, and leave a comment for Noelle or me at artbizpodcast.com. Look for episode 224. Find Noelle and her art at noellephares.com. I know you have a busy artist life, and I appreciate your letting me into it.